Hi, I'm Katie, and this is the Free Art and Design School podcast web series, Whatever. I have another friend joining us here today. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Fritz. I am an artist. I do a lot of different stuff. Um, I've worked a lot in like painting in the past, but if I assume Katie's going to drop a little Instagram link. If you look at that, it's going to be like mostly landscape photography, which is not what I was expecting it would have been, even a few years ago. But I do a lot of different stuff. Painting, drawing, collage, photography, obviously, which I've gotten into within the last couple of years. And then I also have a day job that sort of allows me some amount of creative freedom. I work as a brewer, so I get to, apply some amount of creativity and artistry a little bit to making beer, which is also pretty enjoyable. So yeah, I do a lot of stuff. I live here in Southern California. Um, Spent most of my life here, although I lived on the East Coast for a while. Got an MFA at the museum school at Tufts in Boston. Um, and that was a really, really kind of formative experience for me. I don't necessarily, I'm not going to tell everyone to get an MFA because obviously there are drawbacks to it. A lot of them financial. um, it also was something that was very formative in my life and really kind of influential on my artistic career in a number of ways.
Yeah, I think you were one of the first friends I knew who got an MFA. And I
Yeah,
remember before I got my MFA, I was like, is it worth it? And I like asked you, and you're like, yeah, like maybe, but maybe not. Like,
yeah.
And I was like, yeah, that seems kind of like the general vibe. I'm sort of wondering what like led you, or like when did you know that you wanted to pursue art, and that you wanted to like have an academic approach to pursuing art? Because it's a pretty serious decision to like decide to get an MFA, especially in something like
Yeah,
painting or fine art.
yeah. Um, I mean, I think it came from like, I mean, just rewinding. Like, I've been, making art in some capacity or another for like pretty much my whole life. From a very very young age, I started drawing, and growing up like a little kid, I was always the kid who was good at drawing. That's like what people knew me for. Um, and I think in high school and then in college, it wasn't as much a part of my life. Um, I took like art in high school. There was an art class that I took, one period a day. But that's only like so much that you're doing. Um, and it's a very, structured kind of curriculum. So that doesn't, it's not the full experience of being an artist by any means. Um, when I started college, I actually entered college as an architecture major.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I was very, when I was drawing as like a kid, the things I like to draw were like buildings and cities, that kind of stuff. So that kind of naturally, like I was architecture was something I was interested in, and I started in the architecture program at USC, and did that for a year and a half, and then realized that just really wasn't for me, for various reasons. I think that was probably my first brush with like, all of the disillusionment that comes from doing like anything creative. It was kind of this realization that it's like 5 years of really, really rigorous um, schooling. And then once you do that, you get like, a job where you're sitting in front of a computer with like AutoCAD. And it's like, okay, move this wall 4 inches and move this cabinet 5 inches, right? It's not, you're doing the minutia of like other people's art, right?
Yeah.
You're doing all the little shitty tiny tasks that they don't want to be responsible for, and that's most of what being like an architect is. And being like 19 or 20 years old at the time, like that was not. I was like, no, fuck that, I don't want to do that. So at the same time, I mean, I had this background in, you and I know each other from debate land, and I've also been like an argumentative and kind of analytical sort of person. So um, I was interested in politics, and I was like, I'm going to get a political science degree and probably go to law school.
Yep.
Um,
Been there.
yeah. Uh, and then it was another realization of like, I don't, I like arguing. I like thinking. I like thinking in that sort of argumentative space. That's something that I like doing competitively on a weekend. As like that was sort of my activity. That was the sport for nerds that I did, and I liked coaching it too. Um, but in terms of what actually goes into being an attorney, I was like, I don't want to go through this extra schooling, and I don't want to be just in a library with my nose buried in books all the time. Like I like reading, but not that much. Um, so then I decided that really wasn't for me. And I think I kind of had this realization later in those years, like towards the end of college, that like really what I was interested in was just something that was just creative expression. Like that was sort of the light bulb moment for me. And some of that, um, it just takes different life experiences, maybe certain substances to kind of help you reach that conclusion. Um, but I did, and I just said I want to make art. And I kind of really like dug into like making art for the sake of making art again. I started drawing and painting way more than I had in years. Um, and my decision to get an MFA was really like, okay, well, I really love doing this. Let's try to make a career out of it. And I like talking to people about things that are interesting to me. I like teaching, so I was like, let's get a degree with the idea that I'm gonna teach. I'm gonna be a professor, which is what I think a lot of people do when they enter an MFA program.
Yeah.
Um, and where I am now, like I earn a salary, I earn an income. It has nothing to do with teaching anyone about art. And getting to that point was just that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it was in a roundabout way kind of a practical decision, if you could call it that. It's like I want something to allow me to get like a salaried, sustainable career in something that is creative and something in the arts. Um, and I decided to get an MFA, and I did. The program that I was in was really cool. The museum school is run through Tufts University, but it's also affiliated with the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which is a great,
Mhm.
just classic art museum. Um, and it's a pretty large MFA program. Um, and like I think in my graduating class, it was like 50 something people, which is
Oh,
a
wow.
lot.
Yeah.
We did at the end of it, there's a big like show for all of the artists, and it was in a huge space. I mean, it was because it was like 50
Wow.
something artists presenting. It was awesome. But yeah, very big program. And I did not know everyone even by the end of it. I certainly knew some people very well, and I still have friends from that program.
Was it 50
um,
painters or 50 fine artists, like
well,
different
so
strokes?
that was what was cool about it. It was very mixed. It was very interdisciplinary, and the I got an MFA in painting, so to speak, because when I was in the program, that's mostly what I was doing. Like I was doing painting and drawing and that kind of stuff. That's because that's just kind of what I was interested in artistically at the time. But the classes that I was taking were not, with a couple of exceptions, were not like just geared towards people who were doing painting and drawing. Um, I was taking classes alongside performance artists, sculptors, photographers. Um, there's all kinds of fine art practices, which I think is really cool. Like my thesis advisor is like a video and sound artist,
Ooh,
um,
very cool.
but I learned a lot from him. He was great. Um, so it's you're getting a lot of input from a lot of different perspectives, which I think is useful. Um, and to put it in kind of the simplest terms, I think that when you are exposed to that many modes of making art in that kind of environment, you realize that the whole point of being an artist is basically to just do whatever the fuck you want. Um, and that was kind of the most, I think, valuable lesson that I got from the program. I think that if I had been just alongside other painters, I would have like honed specific aspects of painting um, really well, and I think that would have been useful. But I think sort of from a broader view, from a little bit of a higher view, um, it was just it taught me to be more open minded about what I can do with my art and what like doing creative things can be. So that was very, very useful.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And I have some sort of similar experiences, like being
Hmm.
disillusioned, and then like maybe I'll
Yeah,
work in
yeah,
law, and then I was
yeah,
disillusioned again, and then I went to
yeah.
an art program where like most of my friends were animators, and I was,
Right.
taking classes in cinema, and all these other um, experiences were really influential to sort of, I guess, part of being in art school is like learning that the art world is different than you expect it to be, both in like really sad, horrifying ways and also in
Yeah,
exciting ways.
yeah,
Um, and I'm sort of curious, like, um, maybe you could talk a little bit about like the kind of art you produce. There's some of your work behind you. Um,
yeah. There's a yeah. Uh,
and you've done like, I feel like now you're doing more collage stuff that I've seen, but you also do these beautiful paintings, and like you're also, like you said, very politically engaged. So I'm wondering like, maybe how you situate yourself as an artist now, even though you're not doing it full time.
yeah. Uh, I think that I mean, to some extent, I don't really know why it is that I picked like this. I'm going to do this type of art, this one, and this one. Um, I think it's just that's kind of what I've felt the desire to do. I take a very like path of least resistance approach to like making things and coming up with ideas for things. Um, some of the idea for doing collage came from, I worked for a little while as an assistant at an art studio that did like some collage work. So that there was just kind of having that in my life,
Mm.
um, got me interested in doing collage, which is something I hadn't really thought of before. I have a piece that I'm working on. I have I'm in a house. I have a studio set up in my garage, which is nice. Um, didn't really always have the luxury of that when I lived on the East Coast, but I guess that's one benefit of the Southern California lifestyle. Um, so I have a piece set up down there that I've been working on slowly, and I have another. You can't really see it, but a collage piece back there. I did that about 3 years ago.
Wow.
Um, those pieces I don't do them frequently, mainly just because compiling like all of the source material for a collage that's like decently large, like 3 feet by 4 feet. Um, just getting all that source material takes a lot of time and a lot of money.
Yeah.
So I kind of this piece um, I will say the collage pieces I think are more there's more of like I that's the type of work I would be doing now if I were currently in an MFA program, because
Yeah.
I think the work that I could most readily like sit down and write a thesis about. It's the one that I'm kind of doing the most kind of pedantic intellectualizing about. Which, with that in mind, if you look at some of the imagery in this collage, I can that's kind of funny. Um, but
You're the
you
new
know,
Rauschenberg, you know.
there you go, there you go. Um, it's the piece that I'm working on right now. The center of it, like in the exact physical center of the composition, is this cutout of a Disney castle. It's from Disney World in Florida. And I was in the checkout line at the grocery store, and I saw like just they have those like magazines there, and there were like I don't know, whatever, how many years of Disney and celebrating Disney parks, and just like that image caught my eye, and I was like, that's got to be something. I was just like, I want that in a collage piece. I want to do. I haven't done a collage in years. I want to do that. Um, I remember years ago reading this kind of scholarly article by the author's names escape me. It was a while ago. I read it. But they were talking about the difference between urban spaces in like East Coast and Midwest cities versus like Los Angeles, for example, and how like New York and Chicago are kind of examples of modern cities, whereas Los Angeles is an example of like a postmodern city in terms of like how the built environment is laid out. And I think there was something just about like that kind of landscape composition with like the Disney castle in the middle and just all of this composite imagery of like stuff that you associate with like just kind of the schlocky plastic culture of Southern California.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I've been going with. But I was able to. My parents were clearing out their garage recently, and there were some old like coffee table books, and a lot of it was like very architectural stuff.
Cool.
But they were like, "You got to get rid of this. Like 31 years old and you still have stuff in our garage. So I drove out to their house and picked it up. And I was able to source a lot of material from that. And I got just a bunch of old magazines from people. My mom had various old magazines. A few months back, my grandfather died, so they were going through his stuff, and he had a bunch of old like Smithsonian's and New Yorkers and stuff like that, National Geographics. Um, and then my roommate gave me a stack of like old porno mags. So
So good. I love that. I was at a
so,
collage
yeah.
party recently that like my friend had me pay $10 to go to, and I was like, that's ridiculous. I will never do that again. But it was all like 50s, 60s like newspapers and like magazines, and then one porn mag. And I was like, this is the perfect juxtaposition. This is amazing. Do you view your kind of works as like visual critical essays almost, like, because obviously you have like a viewpoint and like an argument that you're trying to get across by like
Yeah,
juxtaposing imagery, which is the foundation of most artwork and graphic design. um
right.
but I'm sort of wondering if you like have that intentional critical perspective when you like go into making something, or whether it evolves like as you're making it.
Um, I would say more so for these collages. And I don't know if it's just like these particular collages and working with like, you know, with found imagery as opposed to like, paint that's smeared on a canvas just kind of creates like more of an actual conversation that's going on in the image. Um, because I also have pieces that I work on that are really just like abstract paintings. Um, it's just abstract expressionism. And I don't think that there's honestly like as much of that like kind of intellectualizing that goes into them. It's just like I'm gonna create like a composition of colors and textures and tones that looks cool, and kind of create some ambiguity for the viewer to interpret.
Mm.
Um, so it really depends on like what I'm trying to do, or rather like what exact medium I'm working through.
Yeah.
How much quote unquote like critical thought is going into it. Some of them probably have critical thought and some of them have uncritical thought. It's very just like gestural. It's like smear this here, let it dry, put another layer on. And it's very like improvised.
Yeah, I think it's really impressive, kind of your vast repertoire of different work you have, because your photography is stunning. Like,
Thank you.
you could have just billed yourself a photographer, and most people would have no idea that you're also this painter and collage artist and brewer.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of, and we can talk about brewing in a little bit too, but like, I think there's a critical pressure, especially due to social media, where artists, and even before social media, artists have been kind of like forced to identify in a certain way, or forced to
Yeah.
have one medium or one thing they do. And when they don't, it's like, unless they're like a really famous artist like Warhol, who can do like,
Right.
silk screening and sculpture and whatever, like, how do you sort of make sense of that with your work? Because it seems sort of like you're just like, I don't give a fuck, I'm going to do what brings me pleasure. But maybe you have a sort of better answer to that question.
Well, I think part of it is because I am not focused on making as much art as possible with the idea that I am going to earn my living off of this art. That constrains you in certain ways because like you spend huge parts of your day not making that art that you want to be doing. But the other side of it is, you know, what's paying your rent, what's paying the bills is something else that you were doing. And so now you have that creative freedom to just do what you want for the sake of doing it. So that's sort of the trade-off. Um, I think that in terms of like, you're right about like social media kind of pigeonholing people in certain ways. And I've had like so many conversations with people. Um, a lot of it's like, oh, you should make separate accounts for like your paintings and for your photography, and like a separate account where you just like, where I just like shit post the stuff that I put like on my Instagram story.
Yeah.
Like a meme page basically. And part part of it is I just am lazy. Like I already waste so much time, like so many people just mindlessly scrolling on my phone, and I don't want to like be even more invested in that than I have to be. So
Mhm.
um that's part of it. But I also just think like even if not focusing on one thing does like it makes the algorithm sort of select against you or
Yeah.
whatever. I do think that there's something enjoyable about consciously, like with an eye towards social media, like cultivating a quote unquote brand that has that kind of has its fingers in a lot of different things. um so that's part of it as well. It's hard to like really be like authentic in the world of social media, but I think that like by just doing lots of different stuff that I want to do, I think I can be a little bit more authentic in that regard, rather than trying to confine certain things to certain audiences that are really just interested in that. um but yeah, the I've said this sort of half seriously, half jokingly, like my art is my like painting and collage work and drawing is like my art, and like making beer is my job, and photography is my hobby. which which is kind of funny because it still like requires it's still like artistic output of some amount. So um but yeah, I mean, I mostly just do it because I enjoy taking the pictures, but half the fun is also just like being able to like go somewhere pretty and like go on drive through a really nice place or hike through a really nice place, um and then sort of capture that through like a photo album.
Yeah. And you've been doing mostly like national parks or state park photography?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, some of it's national parks. It's just these days it's stuff that's within like a weekendable drive of Southern California, which fortunately is a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
part of the benefit of living on the West Coast is there's just so many different landscapes within a reasonable drive of here. I mean, there's beautiful beaches and mountains and forests and deserts and all kinds of stuff. And I'm really fortunate to be in proximity of that. I think when I lived on the East Coast, that was something that I really realized I was missing.
Mm.
One of the reasons why I decided to move back here. Um,
We all move back. It
yeah,
happens to the
yeah,
best of us.
yeah,
Inescapable vortex of Los Angeles.
yeah.
Uh yeah. That's super interesting. Yeah, it's so funny that that's like your go-to phrase, because obviously being a photographer is like its own art form and like requires
Mhm.
a very critical eye, and like you have such an eye for like color and composition. I mean, this is kind of like a stupid question, but do you think being a painter first like helped you kind of like craft an eye for what you're looking for in your photography, or do you view them as sort of like separate practices that you engage in?
Yeah. It like I'll tell you straight up, like I have a very simple camera. I got it a few years ago as like it was a either a birthday or Christmas present, I forget. Um and it's a Canon Power Shot. It's like a
Oh,
300
wow.
something dollar camera. Yeah, it's super
Huh.
basic. I rarely if ever use a tripod. Um it has its limitations. It's not great at taking stuff that's like far away. So if you want to do like kind of deeper compositions, it struggles with that. They'll if you're trying to capture a mountain or something, it's really far away, it'll look really small and compressed. um but for shooting stuff that's closer or kind of in middle range, it works just fine for that. um I do a lot of my shooting like just on auto settings. I occasionally will adjust one thing or another, but most of the time it's just on auto settings. And the strategy that I've developed for taking photos is basically I'll go to a place and just take like a ton of photos. And
Yeah.
if something catches my eye, I snap a picture of it, and then you know zoom in a little bit, zoom out a little bit left, a little bit right, a little bit up, a little bit down, do it again, wait a few minutes, see if the clouds change or the
Mhm.
lighting changes or whatever. Especially if I'm photographing like water or something, I'll just try to get the exact wave crashing in the exact way I want to, or whatever. um and I have just a huge stack of photos to go through at the end. And then I'll take the card out and upload it to my laptop, and then I just go through and select the handful of compositions that I liked, and then um do some like post-production editing with Lightroom and Photoshop to get like the lights and the shadows and all that stuff the way that I want.
Wow.
um
That's like
yeah.
ridiculously shocking that you don't have like a ton of professional equipment or anything. You're just
Oh yeah,
patient.
super basic.
Huh. I worked at a camera shop for a while, and that's a story for another day. But oh my God. I mean, that is a saying, right? Like that it's more about like your eye than it is about the fancy equipment you have.
Yeah, and I guess sorry to go back to the question you asked me. Yeah, I do think that like my background in painting and drawing gives me like just an eye to like select the right composition and adjust it the way that I want to and all of
mm,
that.
okay. Yeah, and that's super interesting because so much of your work is like not landscapes. It's like abstract,
Mm.
pretty like symmetric, I think a lot of your work is, or
Yeah,
tends to have
yeah.
a lot of balance in it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, I'm not cheating. I know your other work, not just the one that I do. Um, I'm wondering if you, now that we've talked so much about your art practice, I'm wondering if you have a story or sort of, how you became a brewer and sort of how you sort of remedied that in your mind between the kind of like ancient craft of brewing and then also being an artist.
Yeah, sorry. My phone's about to die. I'm gonna try and plug it in. Hold on
Oh
one
my God,
second.
take your time.
Here it is.
Amazing.
Okay, let's try this again.
I've done this on so many of the interviews. You'd think I'd be more prepared when I have my own show, but
Okay, this is better. Okay,
evidently not.
um, so how I got into brewing, it, I mean, it's just, I think to like be a good painter, you have to look at paintings, and to be a good writer, you have to read. And I got into brewing because I like beer. It's something I enjoy drinking. Um, and I think just, being sort of a creative person, eventually when I came to appreciate beer enough and kind of learn something about it, it's like, okay, I want to try making it. Um, so, a lot of people who brew professionally start out, um, home brewing, which is what I did. And it was, again, a pretty simple system. I wasn't doing anything too crazy. And the first several beers I made were not very good.
Yeah.
Um, but there's a lot that you have to learn. It Making beer is both. Lots of people say this, and it's true. It's both an art and a science.
Hmm.
Um, and it's interesting because a lot of people in the world of brewers, like in that kind of subculture in that industry, it's an interesting mix of people who have a background in the arts or a background in like the hard sciences or in engineering or something like that, because it really is kind of at the intersection of those two things.
Yeah.
You have to know a lot about science, and I can tell you, like, there's so many things that I think back to, like taking science classes like in high
Yeah.
school and middle school, and even like some for elective credit in college and stuff, where like a lot of the stuff really didn't make, like, it in an abstract sense didn't really make a ton of sense to me. And then once you have like something to apply it to, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, that's what an enzyme is, like that. Okay, that makes sense now. um that's what an acid does, that's what a base does. So that's really cool. um but it is like also a creative expression. There's art in kind of designing a beer and coming up with a recipe, and then in learning from what separates good beer from bad beer, there's also art in that, because um tasting a beer, smelling it, thinking about what it looks like in the glass and all of that sensory experience, um, does kind of draw upon creative faculties. When people try a beer or a wine or a spirit or whatever, they say like, "Oh, I don't have a good palate for it," or "I'm not like one of those people who's like fancy and pretentious about it." It's not like when you taste a beer or a wine or whatever that you're not like tasting the same stuff that other people who are more seasoned are tasting. Those people just have like a broader vocabulary for talking about it. Um, and that process of like tasting a beer and saying like what it smells like, or what it tastes like, that is artistry. And then being able to apply that to what you want to do. You can try a stout and say like, oh, this tastes like espresso, or this tastes like bittersweet chocolate, or you can try an IPA and say this tastes like grapefruit. No, it doesn't. It tastes like a beer. You're drinking a beer. But you are when you drink that, you are remembering a time when you had espresso or you had
Mhm.
chocolate or you had grapefruit, right? That's it's nostalgia, it's a memory, it's a sensory experience that is related to another sensory experience that you had. And I think that way of like perceiving it is something that we do in the fine arts all the time. So there definitely is a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, I'm sort of obsessed with talking to people who are interested in these things that are very much like science and art together. So something like
Mhm.
ceramics, like is very much
Yes.
like a
Yeah,
physics chemistry thing. And
definitely.
like being a film photographer and processing your own film is similarly like just as much about having an artistic eye as it is about like
Hmm.
chemical development.
Very much.
Beer making clearly is the same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, do you think obviously you were drawn to it because you like drinking beer and you're like creative and you're like, I want to understand how something like this is made. Like, do you think you sort of have an innate curiosity towards something like beer making because you're interested in the physical process of it? Or is that like at the level we're in, whatever, 2023, like so far removed that
Yeah.
that's like not even something that's like done really? It's also
Yeah.
really technical.
Yeah. Um, I think that interest or curiosity about the physical process, I don't think that's what initially got me interested in it. But I do think that now that I have that experience, that's one of the things that keeps me interested in it.
Hmm.
Um, and it's the steps of how, I mean, the general, loosely speaking, the process of how you make beer is pretty much the same no matter what equipment you're using or where you are. Um, but there are differences in terms of like how automated your machinery is and stuff like that, and all that has an effect on the process itself. And that's true if you're making art. Like there's a difference between like physically applying paint to a canvas versus like printing out a digital image, even though they both are examples of making art.
Hmm.
um and for me, the learning about how beer was made was sort of just a slow process of like kind of compiling and gleaning information the more I became interested in it. um you know I I started home brewing because it wasn't like I just want to learn about how beer is made. It's like I want to make beer and be like, this is cool. I made this beer. And I also like, making labels for the beer. And that's also something I do. Like I brew professionally, and then I also design the can labels for another brewery.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, and that's fun too. Like just making and that's sort of a graphic design crossover.
That's
Um,
cool that you're, like, involved at sort of, like, every level of the
yeah,
process. 'Cause it also means
yeah.
that you have, like, skin in the game and that you're, like, concerned about the outcome of the thing, and you're not just like,
Mhm.
"Eh, whatever, it sells well." You're like, "No, I wanna, like." It's like you're a perfume artist or a candle artist. You're like, "No,
Yeah.
I'm, like, really committed to understanding how to make this thing better and then how to, like, tweak it."
Right.
Um, do you think, like what's, like, your sort of philosophy on brewing now that you've done it for a little while? Like, do you have a
Yeah.
kind of, like, broader perspective on how it's affected your life and maybe your art practice or maybe not?
Um, I think so. I'm sort of at the stage where I'm just now getting to the point where I'm like writing my own recipes that are being used for like, commercially produced beers. It's a job that's a vocational job, and there is schooling for it.
Hmm.
There are programs that you can go to learn how to be a professional brewer. I chose not to do that because I already had done a lot of schooling and I don't need to take on more debt and more time. So the way that a lot of people learn it is just through apprenticeship. Like you kind of get your foot in the door somewhere, and that's what I did. I, I how I got into brewing was, I was working, I'd worked like front of house at breweries, which is not something I enjoyed doing, but like it was paying the bills and allowing me to make art, so I was doing it. Um, and a friend of mine who used to be one of my neighbors was a professional brewer,
Hmm.
and he got me the gig doing the can labels because the brewery he was working at started canning their stuff, and he knew I was an artist and thought my artwork would work well for kind of what they had in mind. um, but he put me in touch with the folks at another brewery I worked at, just because like he knew them and knew that they were hiring. And it's just sort of, I talked about like the path of least resistance. If you are a painter, if you are a musician, if you are a writer, anything like that, to get where you want to go, some of it is just like the luck of knowing the right people and being in the right situations. And that's kind of what has worked out for me in terms of making beer. It's something that I was interested in, and just kind of, that's the path of least resistance. Like those are the doors that open for me. So that's where I am. And I started out like pretty green, and you start out with just like, okay, you're gonna wash the kegs, or you're going
Right.
to clean the tank, or you're going to mill the bags of grain, while someone else who's way more seasoned and experienced is going to be actually making the beer. And then over time you develop new skills, and you learn more about the process. And now I'm getting to the point where I'm actually able to like write my own recipes and brew my own beers that are, that's my product. I made it. And that's cool. And it's, thus far it's been working professionally. It's been a couple years now.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
like very cool and fulfilling to hear that you sort of like made that arc in this new like really an art form.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
we're like almost out of time actually. And I feel like I
Okay.
have a million questions I could still ask you. The one I am going to ask you is sort of like, if you had advice to sort of your younger self from 10 years ago,
Yeah.
what do you think you would say?
Man. Um,
No one likes this question.
yeah. It's also one of those where it's like, okay, do I have all of the information, like every single ounce of information I have now?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of things I would do differently. Um, I mean, I think that if I could have all of the information and all of the experience from an MFA program, stored away in my brain, but then be able to like retroactively go back and make it not happen, I would probably do that, just to save some money and some time.
Well, that's the point of
Uh,
this project I'm
but
doing.
you can't do that. So I'm not going to tell people that they shouldn't go to graduate school for art, because that's not how the world works. Um, yeah, I think that I guess what I would tell myself is that kind of the broader lesson of like, do things that are interesting to you for the sake of doing them, because like, what the hell else is the point?
Mm,
Um, like learn that lesson sooner, right?
yeah.
Like don't go into it with the idea of like, I have to do this one thing and I'm going to be checking these boxes with this goal in mind. Like, be open to changing your plans, be flexible, be willing to see other perspectives and new experiences, and just be more open-minded about what you're trying to do with creative, with your creative faculties.
That's a perfect ending note. So thank you so much for being here.
Of
You're
course. Thank
amazing. It's
you.
amazing to catch up. It's been like 1,000 years. I feel so old, but also so excited hearing all of your work processes. So thank you for being here.
Of course. Thank you.
Of course.